When I took office, the pandemic was raging and our economy was reeling. Supply chains are broken, millions of people unemployed, hundreds of thousands of small businesses on the verge of closing after so many had already closed. Literally hundreds of thousands on the verge of closing. Today, the U.S. has the highest economic growth rate leading the world economies since the pandemic, the highest in the world.
That was President Biden making the case for how his policies have benefited the U.S. economy in what the White House now calls Bidenomics. You've heard that before. But with inflation still weighing on Americans' wallets, the White House is working to promote the broader economic message. Joining us now is Jared Bernstein, chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisers. Jared, thank you for being here today. President Biden planning for the future. I would argue that it's more important what Americans think about the economy, at least when they're voting a year from now, 15 months from now. What is President Biden doing now to ensure the success of the U.S. economy, especially over this next year to two?
Well, as you heard in his speech today in Chicago, he's framing out this idea of Bidenomics, which is building the economy from the middle out and the bottom up. And he's making a stark contrast between that and top-down or trickle-down economics, the failed idea that if you just cut taxes for rich people, that's going to somehow uplift the middle class, against decades of evidence that it just doesn't work that way. How does it work? Well, the three pillars of Bidenomics are reinvesting in America, reversing years of disinvestment in our public goods in a way that crowds in hundreds of billions of investment from the private sector, promoting more competition, both to lower costs and to give small businesses a fair shake, and empowering and educating our workforce. Put those together and you have a strong recipe for continuing some of the positive growth that we've seen thus far and continuing to make progress against inflation.
Jared Bernstein, it's great to see you here, Shauna. But what stuck out to me a couple of things stuck out to me in this speech. Well, one thing that did stick out to me was when the president said that he wasn't declaring victory yet. And I bring this up because from your perspective, as one of the top economic advisors to the president, what do you view as the or one of the biggest dangers to the economy? And how are you what's your plan just in terms of how you plan to work to address that?
Well, look, this is an economy, as I'm sure you've had in many discussions, that has some real headwinds. We obviously had some challenges in the banking sector, so important for credit flows. We have a hiking cycle. We have inflation that has come down significantly but needs to come down more. But also, some really important tailwinds. And I think too often people maybe don't get that balance quite right, especially those who look around and say we're in some kind of a recession. I don't think the data support that at all. And in fact, I think if you look at the recessionary indicators, they're all pretty clearly in a non-recessionary place. But if you look at a virtuous cycle between a tight labor market generating wage gains, generating consumer spending, which of course is almost 70% of nominal GDP, it becomes a little bit less of a mystery why we keep having this positive cycle, why we keep having job gain months that beat the forecast, I think 14 or 15 months in a row. So that kind of virtuous cycle is a real tailwind. There's also headwinds, and that's just the way it is right now. We have to, we have to be mindful of both of those forces.
And we heard from Fed Chair Jerome Powell earlier today, once again reiterating that 2 rate hikes could be necessary at this point in order to get inflation under control. You just mentioned the strong jobs market. If we do see 2 more rate hikes and consecutive at that, Powell saying that that's on the table, what do you think that is going to do to the labor market?
Well, I think without getting into any granular critique of Federal Reserve policy, which, I think one of the more important things we can continue to do to help inflation ease is make sure the Fed has the independence they need to do what they have to keep doing, what they have to do. I think it's important for us to recognize that Pillar 2, particularly today, Pillar 2 of Bidenomics is making sure we have an empowered and educated workforce. Now, what does that mean? when we talk about worker empowerment, one of the things we're talking about is the tightest job market in decades. Unemployment below 4% for a year and a half. Now, that's the overall number, but we know that that means particularly low employment for groups that are far too often left behind. And that's something this president is acutely aware of. The importance of tight labor markets, he talked about it today under the rubric of full employment. The importance of tight labor markets to give workers a little bit more bargaining clout. That's also why he's one of the world's most pro-union presidents we've seen. Now, add that to educating our workforce so that we can complement things like our CHIPS program, where we're incentivizing significant investment in that sector, standing up a domestic semiconductor industry, and you're helping to build out the economy's supply side, in this case, labor supply, but also chips and infrastructure. Building out the economy supply side, its capacity, puts medium and long-term downward pressure on inflation.
Jared, while we have time here, I just wanted to bring up the fact you were recently promoted to the chair of the Council of Economic Advisers. What does the Council of Economic Advisers look like right now, and what kind of transition, if any, has it been undergoing?
Well, what it looks like is a staff of about 30 junior and senior economists who are some of the best economists in the country who come to CEA to help serve this president and his vision of Bidenomics. And we continue to do what we've been doing, which is provide the president and the senior staff with up-to-date analysis information on the data flow, much of the same kind of things you talk about here. Try to look around the corners and see where those headwinds and tailwinds I just talked about are taking us. Of course, every year we write the economic report of the president. And look, at the White House, we're very much involved. The CEA is very much involved in our policy processes as well, as we think through how to best implement our investments in clean energy and electric vehicles and semiconductors, making sure that the economy stays on track at the same time that we're building from the bottom up and the middle out, very much in the spirit of Bidenomics.
You mentioned the investment that the Biden administration has done with the CHIPS Act. Obviously, chips being a priority, bringing manufacturing to the U.S., a massive priority here for the Biden administration. There was also a report from the Journal this week just that we could see more crackdowns on exports to China of those chips. I'm curious from your perspective, the economic implications, if any, of these wider crackdowns. Do you see any from that?
Well, certainly one of the values of the legislation that we've been talking about, whether it's the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, or the bipartisan infrastructure law, is learning a critical lesson from the pandemic about the importance of resilient supply chains. Now, look, inputs, intermediate goods flowing here from abroad, that's still going to be part of our economic model, of course. I mean, if you just look at battery production, yes, we're very interested and full speed ahead in terms of developing EV and battery production here in the United States. But some of those materials are going to come from abroad because that's where they exist under the ground. So I think we're going to have to both be mindful of the importance of our trade flows while we really implement one of the insights of this president in this space, which is that for years, trade policy was built over the concept that workers, that Americans are solely consumers and not workers. That as long as we think about cheap goods, Americans as consumers, fine. But look, if trade policy is hollowing out a community, if it's shipping jobs overseas, if our system incentivizes manufacturers going abroad, that is not something that's okay with this president. That is antithetical to Bidenomics, to investing here. So yes, absolutely the case that Americans are consumers and they benefit from trade flows, but they're also workers. And that's one reason why 800,000 manufacturing jobs since this president took office, that's a very important benchmark for us.
One of the other things that President Biden did tout in his speech today was the high-speed internet expansion across the U.S., a massive investment here for the U.S. in terms of what that's going to look like over the next several years. This is an interesting topic because a number of Republicans have been touting this investment, even though they voted against it. How are you looking at this? And I guess, what do you think this is going to do just in terms of advancing the U.S. economy for years to come?
Yeah, I saw a tweet from the president today. One of the senators who voted against that measure was touting it, and the president said, see you at the ribbon cutting. Look, I'm an economist. I'm going to keep my head down and work 24/7 on implementing the president's vision, which he ably described today as Bidenomics. A key part of that's really one of the first pillars is domestic investment. Now, this investment, sure, ports, bridges, roads, the environment, education, broadband, as you just talked about, rural broadband, making sure you have affordable access wherever you are. I mean, that's economic oxygen these days, and we know that. But a key point is that these public investments crowd in private investments to the tune of almost $500 billion so far. And you can see that if you look at domestic manufacturing, construction of facilities, it's up. It's about doubled this year, while it was flatlining under our predecessor. So that kind of crowding in of private investment is a key to what we're about here. We're going to implement that. I'm going to let the politics do what they're going to do, delivering on Bidenomics, that's what we're talking about today.
All right. We appreciate you keeping your head down and letting politics do as politics does. Thank you for that, Jared Bernstein, chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors.